On the north tip of Hokkaido, a torii gate stands over a shrine path, and carved beside it is a language almost nobody alive can still speak. That's not unusual. Languages die everywhere. What's unusual is that this one didn't die. It was killed, on paper, by named people, on dated documents you can still go read today. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly whose signature is on that paper, why a 19-year-old girl died the same night she finished the one book that might have saved it, and why, 100 years later, the Japanese government still can't agree on whether the language is dead. Start with the paper. In 1855, the shogunate opens Ezochi to Japanese settlers for the first time, merchants, fishermen, farmers, moving onto land that has belonged to the Ainu for centuries. No treaty gets signed, no negotiation happens. The Ainu are simply already there, and then they are simply not asked. 14 years later, in 1869, the new Meiji government renames Ezochi. It becomes Hokkaido. The same year, Tokyo stands up an entire bureaucratic organ for the job ahead, the Hokkaido Colonization Commission, the Kaitakishi, and gives it one mandate: settle the island, develop it, absorb it into Japan. Here's the fiction the whole project runs on. The Kaitakishi doesn't call Hokkaido occupied, it calls it empty, unowned, terra nullius with a Japanese bureaucracy's stamp on it. And that word, empty, is not a slip. It's the legal hinge the entire colonization turns on, because land that's empty doesn't need to be bought or negotiated for or returned. It just needs to be settled. Surveyors draw plots over hunting grounds. Homestead grants go to Japanese farmers on ground Ainu families have used for generations. The bureaucracy that will spend the next century deciding what the Ainu are allowed to do starts here, with a single word on a single form. Historians now call what happens next Japan's first foreign conquest, the opening move in an imperial trajectory that will later reach Taiwan, then Korea, then Manchuria. But Hokkaido comes first, and Hokkaido is different from the conquests that follow it in one specific way. There is no war to point to. No surrender, no treaty, no army marching into a headline. Just a name change, a commission, and a form that declares the land already vacant. That's the part that makes it hard to prosecute and easy to forget. There was never a single dramatic crime, just a paper trail that quietly made everything after it legal. And paper trails, it turns out, are exactly the kind of thing that survive to be read again. 3 decades later, in 1899, Tokyo goes back to that same drawer and drafts something with an even more deceptive title. It calls the next law protection. The 1899 Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act does not read like an attack. It reads like a welfare program: land grants, farming subsidies, schools. On paper, Tokyo is helping. But look at what each provision actually does, and the word protection starts to curdle. Take the land grants first. Every Ainu household gets an individual plot, but only if they farm it the Japanese way, row crops on fenced ground. Ainu economies had never worked that way. They hunted, fished, gathered, moved with the seasons across shared territory. No single family owned the way the grant requires. So the grant isn't a gift, it's a filter. Families that can't or won't convert to sedentary agriculture simply don't qualify, and the land reverts to the state. The Protection Act protects nothing so much as it protects the state's claim to the land it hands out. Then the act reaches into the house itself. It bans the Ainu language outright, not regulates it, bans it, in schools, in official life, on the record. It prohibits the animist religious practices that had structured Ainu life for centuries, the ceremonies for bears, for fire, for the dead. And it puts Ainu children into segregated schools that teach them only enough Japanese to function as laborers, wrapped in something the law itself calls national ethics, obedience to the state that just took the land under them. So within a single generation, the mechanism is complete. A child born under this law grows up unable to legally speak the language her grandmother spoke fluently. She's taught a version of history where Hokkaido was always Japanese. She's taught farming on a plot that came with strings designed to fail. This is not a policy that happens to have side effects. Every clause does exactly one job: sever the next generation from the one before it, and call the severing protection. And it doesn't sunset. doesn't quietly fall out of use the way old laws sometimes do. The Hokkaido Former Aborigines Protection Act stays on the books, enforceable, for 98 years. A Japanese person born the year it passed could live an entire lifetime, have grandchildren, and those grandchildren could grow into adulthood, and the law banning their neighbors from speaking their own language would still be sitting there, unrepealed, doing its work. It is not struck down until 1996. A year before that repeal, though, in a farmhouse in Noboribetsu decades earlier, a different kind of resistance had already started. Not in a courtroom, but in the handwriting of a teenage girl racing to get her grandmother's stories onto paper before the law or her own body could take them first. Chiri Yukie is born in Noboribetsu in 1903, 4 years after the Protection Act becomes law, into a family that still has what the law is trying to erase. Her grandmother, Mana Chinook, speaks almost no Japanese and knows by heart the yukar, the long-sung epics of Ainu oral tradition, stories that have never been written down because they were never meant to be. They live in breath, in performance, in memory passed mouth to ear. Yukie grows up inside that memory. In 1918, when she's still in her mid-teens, she meets a linguist named Kindaichi Kyosuke, who's trying to document the yukar, but her last fluent tellers are gone. Something in that meeting redirects her whole life. She decides, as a teenager, to spend whatever time she has transcribing and translating the epics her grandmother carries, turning sound into script for a language that, under the law she's grown up inside, was never supposed to have one. The work is slow, and it's hers alone. In 1921, she sends Kindaichi a first manuscript, 13 stories, called Ainu Densetsu. It's a beginning, not the thing itself. She keeps going. And on the night of September 18, 1922, she finishes it, the first written transcription of the yukar to ever exist. The record her grandmother's voice had lived in for a lifetime, now fixed on paper where a law can't touch it and a generation gap can't erase it. That same night, Chiri Yukie dies, heart failure. She is 19 years old. Her anthology is published the following year, 1923, under the title Ainu Shinyoshu. It survives her by more than a century. Every scholar, every revivalist, every neo-speaker who has since tried to reconstruct what fluent Ainu sounded like owes some part of that reconstruction to 13 stories written down by a teenager who didn't live to see them printed. She raced the two things that were both running out at once, her grandmother's memory, aging, and her own heart, which nobody, including her, seemed to know was failing. And she crossed the line hours before the second one caught her. The manuscript made it. She didn't. What she leaves behind isn't just a book. It's proof that the language could be captured in writing at all. Proof against the century-old fiction that Hokkaido and its people had nothing worth recording. Decades later, a different kind of collector picks up where her tape recorder, an actual tape recorder, not a notebook, could reach further than her pen ever could, chasing not epics now, but the very last people alive who could still speak them. By the time Kayano Shigeru is an adult, the fluent Ainu speakers of Chiri Yukie's grandmother's generation are dying out, one at a time, and almost nobody with a recording device is chasing them. So Kayano becomes the one who does. He goes elder to elder across Hokkaido with a tape recorder, collecting hundreds of tales and artifacts before the people who hold them are gone for good. Not translating from memory the way Yukie had to, but capturing the actual voices, the actual sound of the language, while there are still voices left to capture. But collecting isn't enough for him, and that's the turn that separates Kayano from every salvage project before him. A recorded language with no one left to speak it is still a dead language with better documentation. So he builds infrastructure instead, founds 15 Ainu language schools, places where the language isn't preserved behind glass but actually taught, spoken, passed forward, the way Mana Chinook once passed it to her granddaughter, except now on purpose, systematically, before it's an emergency. Then, in 1993, Kayano goes further than teaching. Together with Kaizawa Koichi, he sues the Hokkaido Expropriation Committee and the Sapporo District Court. The case is about the Nibutani Dam, built on Ainu land expropriated without their consent, a smaller, more recent echo of the same empty land fiction from 1869. On March 27, 1997, the court rules. The dam construction is allowed to stand. But the ruling itself does something the 1899 Act spent 98 years refusing to do. It formally recognizes the Ainu as an indigenous people of Japan, entitled to protection of their distinct culture. A courtroom says, in writing, what the government had legislated against for a century. By then, Kayano is already in the Diet. In 1994, he becomes the first Ainu member of Japan's national legislature, elected to the House of Councilors. And when he rises to put questions to the government, he does it in Ainu, the language that was illegal to speak in a classroom for nearly 100 years, spoken now on the floor of the body that makes Japan's laws. It is quite literally the language answering back to the institution that tried to erase it. Kayano dies having built schools, filled archives, and forced a courtroom to say the word indigenous on the record. What he does not get in his lifetime is a law. The court ruling recognizes Ainu culture. It does not obligate the government to anything. That gap between a judge's words and a legislature's law is exactly where Japan spends the next 2 decades stalling. A court can recognize you. It can't legislate for you. That's the distinction the Nibutani ruling leaves hanging in 1997, and it takes 11 more years for the Diet even to begin closing it. On June 6, 2008, the National Diet passes a resolution, bipartisan, unanimous in spirit, calling on the government to recognize the Ainu as an indigenous people. It sounds from a headline like the moment. It isn't. The resolution is non-binding. It creates no funding stream, no legal protections, no enforceable obligations at all. It's the government agreeing, on paper, that it should probably eventually agree on paper. A statement of intent, not a law. So nothing changes right away. Not the schools, not the land, not the status of the language itself. The 2008 resolution sits there for over a decade, doing the one thing non-binding resolutions are good at: existing, unenforced, while the underlying legal architecture, much of which had only just shed the 1899 Act 11 years earlier, stays otherwise untouched. A family that lost its language to a classroom ban in, say, 1910, gets no compensation in 2008. A community still fighting for land rights after Nibutani gets a sentence of sympathy from the Diet floor and nothing to file in court. The resolution changes the weather report, not the weather. It isn't until 2019 that the Diet turns the resolution into an actual law, formally recognizing the Ainu as an indigenous people of Japan with the force of legislation behind it. 11 years, start to finish, between a legislature saying we should and that same legislature saying we do. 11 years in which nobody's status changed, only the paperwork's tone. Line up the dates and the pattern is impossible not to see. 1869, the land is declared empty. 1899, protection is declared and means erasure. 1997, a court declares Ainu indigenous, but a dam gets built anyway. 2008, the Diet declares an intention. 2019, the Diet finally declares the law. Every step in this story is a declaration, and every declaration takes years, sometimes a century, to catch up to what it actually claims to be doing. The gap between what gets said and what gets done is not an accident of slow bureaucracy. It's the same mechanism from 1869, just running in reverse. Instead of one word, empty, doing all the damage instantly, it now takes a document, then a ruling, then a resolution, then a law, each one buying another decade before the state has to actually change anything. Recognition, it turns out, is cheap. Obligation is what costs something, and obligation is what Japan delays as long as the paperwork will allow. So is the Ainu language dead? Ask a linguist and you'll get a hedge, and the hedge itself is the story. By 2017, there are no native speakers of Ainu left. Nobody who learned it first at home as a child, the way Chiri Yukie's grandmother had. That fact alone would usually be enough to call a language extinct. Linguist Thomas Doherty, writing that same year, doesn't use that word. He calls Ainu a dormant language isolate, not dead, dormant, a distinction that matters because dormant implies it can wake up. The 2022 Handbook of the Ainu Language tries to hold both truths in one sentence, calling the language more or less extinct, or dormant as a living medium, but immediately qualifies even that, noting there are still a few native semi-speakers alive, people with partial fluency inherited before the language finished dying, and a growing number of neo-speakers, people who've learned Ainu as adults, deliberately, the way you'd learn any endangered language you were determined to keep from disappearing entirely. A handbook that hedges its own title term in the first paragraph is not being sloppy, it's being honest about a fight it can't referee. Meanwhile, the people themselves haven't disappeared. The 2013 Hokkaido government survey counts 16,786 Ainu living across 66 municipalities on the island. Thousands of people spread across dozens of towns, most of whom likely don't speak the language of their grandparents, because the law made sure of that for 98 years. Ethnicity survives the act. Fluency mostly doesn't. 11,000 people can each tell you they are Ainu, 11,450 surveyed in Hokkaido in 2023, without more than a handful of them being able to tell you a yukar in the language it was composed in. That's not a contradiction. It's the Protection Act's arithmetic, still being carried out by people who never read the statute. So which is it? Extinct, dormant, or something in between that doesn't have a clean word yet? The scholars genuinely disagree, and that disagreement isn't a gap in the research. It's a disagreement about who counts. Extinct means the native speakers are the only speakers that matter, and they're gone, full stop. Dormant means the neo-speakers, the language schools, the transcriptions Yukie died finishing, all still count as the language being alive, just quiet. Choose the first definition, and the 1899 Act finished the job it set out to do. Choose the second, and every neo-speaker learning Ainu today is proof it didn't. The dictionary entry, in other words, is still being fought over by the same two sides, just with linguists standing in for legislators now. Every document that tried to end the Ainu language has a second document sitting across from it, written by someone who refused to let the first one be the last word. The 1869 declaration that Hokkaido was empty gets answered, eventually, by a Sapporo courtroom in 1997, saying on the record that the Ainu are indigenous. The 1899 Act that banned the language in classrooms gets answered by 15 schools Kayano Shigeru built specifically to teach it again. The ban on speaking Ainu in any official capacity gets answered in 1994 by a Diet member standing on the chamber floor and asking his questions in exactly the language that ban was written to erase. Paper against paper, law against law, and the second document, so far, always seems to arrive, just later than anyone would choose. A century between the first paper and its answer is not a fair trade. Nobody who lost a language in 1899 got it back in their own lifetime because a court or a schoolhouse showed up in 1997. The clearest pair, though, is the oldest one. A grandmother who could barely speak Japanese, telling epics that existed only as long as someone's memory could hold them. A law, by then 30 years on the books, that made her language illegal to teach a child in a classroom. And a granddaughter who sat down anyway, transcribed 13 stories, then the rest, then finished the manuscript on a single night in September 1922, and died hours later, having done in one lifetime's worth of work what the 1899 Act had spent decades trying to make impossible. That manuscript is why anyone today can argue the language is dormant instead of simply extinct. It's why neo-speakers have something to learn from that isn't just fragments and guesswork. Whoever gets to decide, finally, whether Ainu is dead, dormant, or coming back, doesn't get to decide in a vacuum. They have to reckon with her handwriting first, and with Kayano's schools, and with a court ruling the government still hasn't fully caught up to. The 1899 Act is off the books, repealed in 1997, the same year a courtroom used the word the Act itself had spent a century refusing to use. But its opposite number, the counterpaper trail, built one stubborn document at a time. A manuscript, a tape recording, a lawsuit, a resolution, a law, is still being added to. Nobody involved in writing it is finished yet. The last page hasn't been filed. Whoever files it next is still deciding, right now, what it will say.